Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our latest productivity talk, organized by the Asian Productivity Organization. This is Polchait Kroprayun of the Public Sector Division of the APO, and we're streaming live from Tokyo, Japan. Today's topic of discussion is a timely one. The title of the talk is Emergency Basic Income in the Time of Pandemic. And while basic income is not a new idea as far as I understand, there's no denying that in recent years and months, it has become increasingly prominent in policy circles and the wider public discourse. Part of this, I think, is because of concerns about increasing inequality, mass automation, and now, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic. To share his knowledge and views on this issue, we're honored to have Dr. Sarath Davala here speaking today. Sarath Davala is an independent sociologist based in Hyderabad, India. He is currently the vice chairperson of the Basic Income Earth Network and also the coordinator of the India Network for Basic Income. He was the research director of the Indian Basic Income Pilot Study and co-author of the book Basic Income, A Transformative Policy for India. He is closely associated with basic income movements globally. He researches, writes, and regularly lectures all over Asia and Europe. He's one of the most prominent advocates of basic income. Prior to this, Sarath was an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, India, and he's author of several books and articles on labor, trade unions, and social policy. So before I hand off to Sarath, I'd like to highlight that today's session will be an interactive one. So anyone who's currently watching and would like to ask any questions or make any comments, please leave them in the live chat. Sarath, would you like to start?
Thank you, Jam, and thank you, APO, for this wonderful opportunity to share my views on this topic. And I'm sure all of you are experiencing this pandemic and its effects. I think there is one thing is the pandemic itself and the healthcare issues it's creating, and another is the economic consequences of the pandemic. All of us are also in this unusual situation of a lockdown, working from home. A lot of people are not able to work from home and having no incomes. Now, coming to this topic, let me start with saying what exactly is basic income for those who are new to this topic. And why is it necessary in the 21st century? Now, 5 important characteristics basic income has. One is it's a modest amount of cash given to individuals. One is it is universal to every permanent resident of a nation or territory. And it is individual and not to the household. It is cash and only cash and not food coupons or any kinds of other token that are given. It is periodic and not a one-time grant. And finally, the most important part of the concept is that it is unconditional. Usually, there are several benefits, there are several transfers, several welfare measures given by various governments. Most of them are conditional upon certain age group, conditional about being a particular gender, conditional about the ability or disability of a person, conditional about the state of a state of unemployment, so on and so forth. But here is an idea which has been discussed last 30 years, is that you should give this cash unconditionally to all citizens so that everybody has a certain basic ground, solid ground to stand on. So that is the concept. But why are we talking about it in 21st century? Why is it necessary to talk about it in the 21st century? Briefly, if you see the nature of employment and nature of employment relations, nature of human resource strategies during 21st century. In fact, this paradigm shift has happened in the last 2 decades of the previous century. The core of the matter of the new business models is to reduce and minimize the human resource liability of any enterprise, any firm. The old model was to give long-term employment, and then give motivation to workers, and people retire. But now I think much of the business model is outsourcing, not only within the country, but outsourcing to offshore locations. And so this globalization has generated that kind of interdependence, that you manufacture it somewhere else to cut down your costs and also liabilities. So given that business model, what has happened because of that is economic insecurity of large sections of population. There's no employment security. And ILO report, recent ILO report says that Indian International Labour Organization says that 2/3 of the global population is on temporary contracts or no contracts, or very unstable contracts. So it's a large section of population, and progressively it's also growing in the OECD countries as well. So given that kind of a scenario, it is no longer a job that is going to give economic security to large sections of the population. You have to come up with new solutions to the new problems. So that is the reason why one is advocating an unconditional basic income across nations, and there's a huge discussion that we are seeing in the last 10 years particularly about this. Now there are two important arguments against basic income. One is that, can we afford it? Number one. The second is that, is it good to give anything free to people? Will that cause a disincentive to work? Will people drink and sit at home in front of the television? Will that cause a social pathology in a society? So these are the two most important objections to anything called unconditional basic income. Now, when it comes to affordability, can we afford to give a basic income to the entire population? Now, there are many reasons, many arguments in favor of doing that. I'll give you a small example. Suppose you go to a doctor and ask the doctor, "Doctor, I want to live for 100 years. Can you suggest something to me that I should be doing?" Okay, but one condition is that I will not change any of my current lifestyle. Is it possible to say to the doctor, and the doctor will simply say that, "Sorry, I will not be able to help you"? Similarly, if you're talking about affordability, I think we have to open many registers, but that we have closed. Now we have something called the commons. It is globally agreed that the natural resources belong to people, and state or the government is just a custodian or a trustee of that wealth. Now, an ordinary citizen who is the owner can ask that, "How are you managing my natural resources? Is it being managed well?" Okay, so when you go to that, you can see it is possible to find sources of wealth that can be given to people. Today we are talking about the data is the new oil. In that kind of a scenario, it is necessary that for every bite of data that you give to corporations, that you have to get dividends for that. When we have taken private inheritance as a natural thing, we have almost taken it for granted that we completely forgotten what is public inheritance. That scientific knowledge itself is public inheritance, but it is getting privatized by some individuals. As a result, what we see is that a small group of people becoming extremely wealthy, and a large section of people becoming extremely insecure and precarious. Okay, so these are the answers. The second is about the work ethic. I think globally all pilots are showing that if you give a basic income, I was part of one of the pilot studies, one of the largest pilot studies in the world. In India, we did a pilot study. All these pilot studies show when you give an unconditional basic income, people do work more. We think people will sit and drink, people will sit and laze around. No, they will work more. They become more creative. They will do what they think is important for themselves. And for example, the care work, so on and so forth. So these are now the point, the upshot of all this is that it's important in the 21st century, for the kind of 21st century problems we have, we need to have a 21st century solution such as an unconditional basic income, because a large section of the population are working in a precarious condition in gig economy that we all of us know. Now come to the COVID context. What has COVID context done? What does it do? What has it done? What is it showing? What have we learned from the COVID context? When you go to an eye doctor, he will first make you, he put some drops in your eyes and makes you sit for a while. Why? Because he wants to dilate your pupil so that it becomes bigger and all the pathologies or inflammation or anything becomes much more visible. Before COVID, there were inequalities. Before COVID, there was precariousness. Before COVID, there was economic insecurity. But now the COVID comes and makes it much more visible. It magnifies it. It makes it, it really amplifies the existing inequalities, existing economic insecurities, and forces us, challenges us, all of us who are talking about public policy, we're talking about social policy, we're talking about productivity, we're talking about a better society, a more stable society, a more stable economy. We are challenged now to find an answer. We are challenged because we can see our vulnerabilities of our society. Now, we are not able to estimate the kind of damage this is going to cause. The health damage, the deaths and the disease is one. But then the lockdown caused by that and the economic consequences of the lockdown are too severe. In fact, if you see 1918, also there was a Spanish flu. Millions of people died. Today, millions, so many people may not die today. But then the economic consequences are going to be very, very severe. The economic distress. So what COVID comes, what one is it makes the landscape so much more clearer to us. Now, what has it done? A very small population is able to sit at home and work. If you take any country, a very small population, a large section of the population which is in the service sector, manufacturing, and self-employed people and street vendors, daily wage workers, all of them from one day to another have lost their incomes. And there are some societies, some countries out there where they do have some kind of an employment dole or employment allowance given, unemployment allowance given, and but there may be a better social security system. But large sections, large countries, number of countries in Asia, in Africa, in South America, you find even in the United States, the number of job losses is shocking to all of us. So COVID and the lockdown that is caused by COVID comes and creates direct income losses. In fact, it is not the job losses, it's the income losses. You don't get people who live from one day to another, one paycheck to another paycheck, one daily wage to another wage, who cannot bring home their food. I think that kind of thing we are able to see. For example, in India, as a India network for basic income, we are coping with an enormous problem of the internal migrants. Nearly about 1/3 of our households in India, which is about 400 million people, they migrate to other places for their livelihood. Nearly about 50 million people, they go to other states, other provinces. Now, all of them, because they have lost their incomes and jobs, they all started walking back to their countries. And we are, as civil society, as governments, coping with that kind of thing where we are actually trying to provide transportations. I was sitting last night till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, overseeing a mass organizing of transportation to so people. So this kind of a major tragedy is unfolding because of the lockdown and the economic consequences of that, and the income losses and job losses. So here, in a situation like this, it is very important that we think of an emergency basic income, because normally it's very, and when in times of distress, a lot of relief work consists of giving food to people, clothing to people, and shelter to people. But how, we never think of giving cash to people. I think lately that has also begun. But I strongly feel people need cash so much more during this period than any other periods that we normal times they do need cash, but in this situation, for medical purposes, for transportation, for any other need, people do require much more now. How long can they bank on their own savings? And poor people hardly have much savings to bank on, so then they start getting into a debt, and that debt generates more stress. So you have large sections of population under extreme stress at this juncture in globally, and particularly large countries like India, uh, and on many countries in Africa. The stories that we get to hear about what is going on in Africa. So in a crisis like this, as much as it is important during the normal times, that as the crisis like this, it's extremely important to talk about an emergency basic income, putting cash into the hands of people. Now, the question is, why is an EBI, or an emergency basic income, extremely important, efficacious, and a good policy? Let me put forth some arguments in that direction. Like, as I have already said, that globally we are experiencing a kind of a gig economy. Very few people have the good old classical full-time long-term jobs when they retire and when they reach 60, 65. Today, most people have very temporary jobs. They work for 2 years somewhere. Some people work for 1 month somewhere. Like, you are a Uber driver, you are also doing something else along with it. People take up 2, 3 jobs. In many societies, that has become very common to have 2 jobs in order to bring home what is required to feed your family. So, in a situation like that, it is important to put cash into the hands of people. When you put cash into the hands of people, they don't go and put it back in the bank in a situation like this. They're going to spend it, which means that the money goes back into the system, that goes back into the economy, and people start buying local things. Okay, so which actually stimulates, it has a multiplier effect, and it stimulates the economy. Normally, we talk about the quantitative easing at a macro level. Now, we are saying that even as you do that, it's also important to do this easing at the individual level. Put money into the pockets of people so that they feel secure during this period of time. We are proposing something like 6 months, 6 months of a basic income should be given to people. I'll come to those examples now. But culturally, most of us in most societies, just as we say that nothing should be given free, that is also a kind of an ethic we have inherited from the industrial revolution, industrial society of the 20th century and earlier. We also are reluctant to give cash. But I think it's only because we have a mindset that says give in kind, don't give cash. Cash is fungible, cash is volatile, cash can be lost, cash can be spent on bad things, economic bads, cash can be misused, cash can be abused. So don't give cash is a kind of a, internally, we have internalized that kind of a cultural norm. Okay, so I think we need to break out of that and begin to put cash into the hands of people, so that it's empowering people actually. Okay, so that is, in that sense, I strongly feel that it is important. I know a lot of countries are giving tax concessions, tax breaks, and also stimulus packages to the small businesses which have been severely affected during this period of time. I think it's also important to do that. But equally important, and this is something that we have neglected so far, equally important is to put money into the pockets of individuals, not households, individuals, because we should put money into the hands of men and women, old people and young people, able and disabled or physically challenged people, and all the others. So we should not categorize people. We should not say that only these people deserve and these people do not deserve. We should not make such distinctions. Now, if you see, US has been one of the most affected in the COVID time, and the infection rates and their graph is very, very steep, and the number of deaths also is very high. Probably it's the highest. Now, job losses are also very high in the US. So I think US has come out with a very good policy of providing 1,200 US dollars to all those who earn, I think, 100,000 a year. People who earn less than that, and then they have, but they have targeted it. It is not universal. Ideal would have been universal, but I think in these times they have targeted and said that these people will get unconditional checks. So similarly, in India, India Network for Basic Income has calculated and said for each individual for a period of 3 months, you should give $52 per month, which is calculated based on the World Bank poverty calculation about what is the poverty line, not the Indian calculation. Indian calculation is much, much lower. So this $52 we have suggested, so that in a family, if there are 3 adults and 3 children, half to the child. That's what we also suggested, half of it to the child, so that when you have 3 adults and 3 children in the house, you get a sum of money that can see you through this difficult period. But I think the government has decided that they will give food grains as usual, which is our culture, that we want to give food to people when they are in distress. Poor means we give food. In fact, I think there's a huge number of people who are giving cooked food to people. That is a very something is a knee-jerk reaction, and most people feel comfortable to give food or food grains to the poor and not cash. So a small amount of cash in different provinces, different amounts of cash has been offered, has been given, but we also have very serious delivery problems. So what is promised and what is actually put in the pocket of X and Y and Z may not be the same. But those are the contextual issues and not necessary. But as a matter of principle, we suggested that in India, and different governments have responded in a different way, because we are a federal system. We have different number of provinces. So the amount they have given is a very small amount, which according to us is not at all. As a result, a lot of money, we are forced, the civil society is forced to raise funds and start giving it to people, and also providing transportation and various medicines and various other things to people. Okay, so similarly, I think a country like Malawi has come out with its own emergency basic income. A country, South Korea, has come out with its own. They have been experimenting with a concept of social economy for a long time. So the first experiment they did was a couple of years ago, where they chose an age group of between 18 and 21. They gave an unconditional income to those people. So similarly, there is also another experiment they have done in terms of stimulating a particular section of the small industry. So people are given unconditional smart cards, and they can spend in those small firms which the government wants to encourage. So different countries have responded in a different way, but I think the amount of money you give should be sufficient enough that people feel secure even when they are staying at home, forcefully staying at home. Okay. Now I think I have just about last 5 minutes. Let us reflect on what does all this mean for post-COVID times. What is the lesson we learn now which we need to implement once we are through with this pandemic. And I believe that we will be through with this pandemic sooner or later. But then, are we as humankind, are we capable of learning lessons from what we have seen during these times? We have had the time, we have had the space to see and understand and reflect during this period because our minds are not cluttered with our normal work. Now, as I said earlier, I will close with these last remarks. As I said earlier, that the social security system that we adopt now is a relic of the 20th century. 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, particularly the post-war years in Europe, was a time when there was a boom of industry. As a result, you were aspiring for a full employment. This is the middle of last century. You were aspiring for full employment, and a small percentage, possibly for a variety of reasons, could be unemployed. And for that small percentage, a system was developed. Okay, now, and that system was for the exceptions. That is a small percentage of those who are unemployed. Now, today in the 21st century, a large section of people are in the gig economy. A large section of people do not have a permanent job. A large section of it's a different matter that when middle class and affluent sections are freelancers. But when a working class person is a freelancer, that today he is doing, morning is doing one thing, evening he is doing something else. This month he is doing one job, another job, because of the unstableness, instability of the economy, the dynamism of the economy, if you prefer to use that term. So in a situation like that, the old system of providing safety net to the exceptions does not fit. We need to have something universal. We need to take care of everybody. Because who normally takes care? Either you have the community or the family, or you have the state, or you have the market. Market is where you transact. You give labor and then you earn an income. State is supposed to look after your education, your birth, your health care, up to your employment and further. Also, it's a responsibility of the state because it's also collecting revenue, collecting taxes. And so, when market is so unstable, when state is no longer as high, still with the old model of social security system, which is not fitting into the newer problems, the burden falls on the family, which is not socially desirable because it could break up the society. It could cause social pathologies in a situation like this. So it's important that states again takes back this responsibility and provides a certain basic minimum to every citizen. When you do that, you are actually creating equity in this society. Last one word I say, and then I will come to a closure because it's almost time. A large section of the population gives free labor, which we never get, which we never pay. Women who perform care work never get paid. It's a huge contribution to the economy, but it goes unpaid. So, given a situation like that, it's important to recognize care work and also give everybody. So, we should not think in terms of saying that only those who are wretched and poor need support. No, it should be a right of every human being to have a certain minimum cash unconditionally. Because we live in a monetary economy, we need cash. If we were living in a barter system, it's a different story. We would have asked something else. So, like we get nature in an unconditional way, it's also important that we get a certain amount of cash unconditionally so that it gives you a certain psychological security, and then you participate in the labor market. It's not that you don't participate. It's not that you will sleep. No, human being is not like that. I would like to trust the human being, that human being has a desire to act, has a desire to be creative, has a desire to participate in the community process. So given all that, it's very important and very desirable and necessary during these times. It's no longer an utopian idea. It is a necessary ingredient of the new social mix of our society. On that note, I would like to thank APO once again, and thanks for listening to me for such a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sarath. I think you've given us quite a lot to digest. I think for the rest of the period for this webinar, we'll move to something a little bit more interactive, maybe a little bit more casual between you and I. And obviously, any commenters are open to ask their own questions, things they're wondering about some of the ideas that Dr. Sarath has mentioned. I think I'd like to start with a quote from author Victor Hugo, which I think is relevant here, or potentially relevant for the idea of basic income, which is, even armies cannot stop an idea whose time has come. Do you think this quote applies to basic income? Has basic income become more palatable because of the steps that governments are currently having to take to provide resources and cash transfers in light of this pandemic? Or do you think in some ways has the pandemic reactive measures complicated the discussion around basic income because of maybe the haste of implementation or the lack of care in their execution?
As I said earlier, Jam, could you please repeat the early part of the question? I was trying to gather with this.
Do you think basic income has become more palatable because of the situations associated with the COVID situation, and the fact that governments are now taking quite strong fiscal measures, for example, to provide resources and cash transfers? Of course, you've seen that, in various countries, for example, Spain, people are beginning to talk about basic income as both a temporary and potentially a permanent measure. So do you think there's something about COVID that has, as you mentioned in your talk, highlighted it? Or do you think that in some ways the hasty reaction and bringing basic income to the spotlight has complicated the discussion around basic income?
Well, I think I have a good friend of mine, one of a very senior basic income advocate, Eno Schmidt, who was one of the people behind the Swiss referendum of basic income. He said once that everybody supports basic income, only they don't know it. Now, as I said, that at one point of time, long back, it was seen as a utopian idea, a desirable thing. Only if you can afford it, let's do it. But today we are seeing that, as you said, that when the time has come for an idea, nobody can stop it. We are seeing that it is necessary. It is really necessary, and COVID comes and really magnifies that idea, as I said earlier. So it is not about governments coming to a hasty policy decision about it, but they are also seeing the need for it, the dire necessity for a policy measure like this. Just as you have to give a stimulus packages to small firms and service industry, small businesses, they are also seeing the necessity for giving it to individuals. And I think the Spanish response and reaction to this whole thing was very, very valid, because that's how most governments also feel. But then culturally there is so many differences that we have, that they're not really able to come forth with a bold policy measure. Sooner or later we will see one of the main countries in the world are going to come out with such a bold basic income policy measure. That's what I'm hoping, because of the need that is highlighted during the COVID times.
Mm-hmm. And Sarath, what do you think about the idea that basic income is something that's more suited for reasonably affluent countries? So countries that have, for example, the digital infrastructure or maybe the technological infrastructure that enables them to deliver cash transfers. They have information on their population. What would you say to, is basic income a policy that's feasible for poorer countries, developing countries? Obviously, you've been involved in some pilots at a smaller scale in the developing world, and obviously there are pilots in the developing world. But is it in your opinion reasonable to expect basic income to be enacted, especially during a time of crisis in the developing world, or do you expect that the first actual case of universal basic income, it'll happen in the developed world?
Well, if the argument is that only affluent countries will can afford it, but I don't see any of those affluent countries actually implementing it. I think it's not an economic issue. I think it's the objection is more coming from the cultural barriers that we have. Now, when I travel to a country, for example, in Japan, when I was lecturing in Japan, I think one of the questions, very predictable thing, was to say that, well, in Japanese people are very secure, and the state has done very well. They don't need a basic income. It's the people in Malawi or Zimbabwe or India that you need basic income. When I sit in India, when I lecture in India, people say, well, I think basic income is suitable for an affluent country. They can afford it, we can't afford it, things like that. But the point I would like to make is that every country needs a basic income. Every individual needs a basic income. Now, it's not a question of affordability. I think the kind of welfare, there's a design fault in our current welfare system. We have to correct that. There's a lot of wastage that happens in our welfare system. We have to correct that. So like I said, that when you go to a doctor and say that I want a better health and better thing, we need to make large, very important structural changes in our society. Then we see the importance of it, and every country can afford it. Every country needs it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned, one of the justifications or reasons why basic income, in particular emergency basic income, is so important during the time of the COVID pandemic, is that it'll serve as a direct form of economic stimulus. It'll put cash in the hands of individuals, not even households, but individuals, so they may spend best according to their needs. This sort of justification or reasoning is slightly different from the reasoning, I think, in traditional arguments for basic income, specifically that if it's a fiscal stimulus in response to an economic downturn, you don't necessarily have the same sense of permanency in the policy. So I think people can say that, oh, this is a good thing to have, for this specific situation because we're in a situation of economic downturn. So I'm wondering is there something about the idea of emergency basic income that makes it, in some ways, it complicates arguments for a more permanent universal basic income?
Well, I think it's a very, very good question. I think in England, in UK, they're also using the term recovery basic income, emergency basic income. So when we use this kind of terminology, we are not talking about firefighting. That's not the idea. What we're saying is that this actually reflects the deeper structure of our society, which is full of vulnerabilities. It exposes, the COVID comes and pandemic comes and exposes our very severe vulnerabilities of our society. The kind of employment system we have developed over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, the kind of labor relations that we have developed, the kind of economic insecurity that is all pervading in our society. Now, emergency basic income is a symptom of a deeper problem. I mean, the extreme vulnerability we see today, during heightened vulnerability we see today, is part of a normal times also. We just see, it's like I said, that it's a dilation of the pupil. You just dilate in order to see. That's what is happening today. So it doesn't stop. It actually makes us see that it's very, very important. If only we give emergency basic income, we'll also see that how it's extremely important. We have always, in the basic income arguments, we've always said that it's when you give cash to the poor, they will not hoard the money. They will not buy unnecessary things. They will buy their basics. That's good enough for they're buying their basics. They will spend it. They will put it back into the economy, as opposed to giving huge hefty salaries and huge dividends to the rich. They can hoard. They can save for the future generations. Okay, or they can park the funds in some other countries. So that's this is an argument not about the COVID time. This is the argument that has always been there. That when you give cash to poor, they spend it in the economy, and sometimes even the local economies flourish. It stimulates the local economy. So this is nothing. That's not a new argument, and it doesn't defeat the purpose and the need for a permanent basic income. That's in my view.
Right. And last week, we had a productivity talk on the topic of how working women's lives were being affected by COVID-19. And keeping this sort of lens of gender in mind, do you think there are particular effects, both positive, negative, or perhaps kind of ambiguous, either found in experiments or in theory, about how universal basic income or basic income programs might affect women in particular?
In fact, the whole idea of the very important characteristic of giving an individual basic income is keeping the gender issue in mind. Normally, the tendency of all public policy, all cash transfers are to the household. Even the food programs are meant for the household. Okay, the receiving unit is always the household. Whereas basic income, we say it should always be individual, so that every woman and every woman, man, and child should feel the entitlement, to experience the entitlement and feel the political citizenship, economic citizenship of living in that society. No, but that's what I said, that the entire care economy, the care work that women do, the household work that women do is completely unpaid. Which, in other words, women, through their care work, unpaid care work, are actually subsidizing the economy. Why should they subsidize? Let us give back what belongs to them. So in COVID, particularly COVID times, I think the same social tendency of the inequalities, patriarchy, they gets again magnified, and women are the ones who are really also suffering during this time. So I think basic income very strongly, the idea of basic income very, very strongly addresses the gender inequality in our society.
Mm-hmm. And how would something like basic income interact with other kinds of welfares? For example, you mentioned that in many countries there are currently, for example, special entitlements given to those living with disabilities or perhaps those with caregiving responsibilities. I know there are different strains of thought around basic income. I'm just wondering what your views are on how exactly basic income should interact. Should it supplant these existing entitlements? Should it be used in conjunction with existing entitlements, and how might they interact with one another?
I think basic income is not the silver bullet or a magic bullet that solves all the problems. In fact, basic income, having a universal basic income in place in a society is a step towards creating a better society. So just by giving basic income at the cost and removing everything else is not at all an idea. It is important that it's the state's responsibility, that there should be public schooling, free public schooling, there should be free healthcare system, there should be various other services that should be provided, and basic income should be given. But I would like to add that we should also try and eliminate all such programs which are inefficient, either by design or by delivery. Sometimes both by design and delivery. Some programs, welfare programs, really do not deliver. So we should have the boldness to completely remove such things and clean up the system. For example, in India, that is one issue. The second issue is that how universal basic income differs from other welfare measures is most welfare measures are targeted. They're targeted to those who have to prove that they deserve it. In order to prove, there are various conditionalities that they have to fulfill. And there are some 20 inspectors watching over you, whether you are telling a lie or whether you're telling the truth, whether you really meet those conditionalities or you are trying to steal money from the system, from the state. So that is problematic. In terms of human dignity, it's not a good idea to treat the welfare recipients like beggars. I think normally everywhere, I think all over the world, that is the kind of, when you say it's welfare, you are seen as somebody who has failed in the society. There's a stigma attached to welfare. Okay, so that's why we say universal is a very important thing, because it removes the stigma. It is not meant for that category of people which has a particular disabilities. I think that stigma should be removed. So basic income comes and removes that stigma. That is, it's unconditional and it's universal. So, which enhances the dignity of a person. Otherwise, it's very demeaning to be a recipient in many societies, in most societies. And people get into a poverty trap. You have to prove, to get an allowance, you have to prove that you are seeking a job. So all kinds of what they call poverty trap everywhere. So people get into poverty trap and they don't want to get out of it. In the US, there's a term called riding the poverty line. Instead of getting out of poverty line, you ride the poverty line because you want to stay. Because the moment you say you're no longer poor, you lose all the benefits. So you get into that kind of a trap. So basic income comes and says that let's get out of that. It's counterproductive. You're demeaning people and you're also making people unproductive. So let's move to, in my personal view, I think in terms of democratic life, in terms of human evolution, adopting a policy like unconditional basic income is the next level, and all of us should aspire to that level.
Mm-hmm. And this is based on a question from the viewer. What about the view that, let's say, a policy like UBI is enacted, and it's universal, it's done without conditions, at least initial conditions, so it's accessible to all, but the state monitors people's use of the basic income in some way, and they find that some citizens use it for example, for things that the state would find socially undesirable, for example, excessive consumption of alcohol, gambling, maybe goods associated with crime, transnational crime. Is there any advocates of basic income that suggest that it's a right to a certain amount of public inheritance that can also be withdrawn in some way? Or should it be unconditional both in the immediate sense and also in the sense of no matter what, the individual has absolute freedom in how they may use their income?
Okay, I'll give you an anecdote. When we completed our pilot study, we had a very big national seminar in New Delhi. So we brought one of the local leaders of the villages, one of the villages where this experiment was conducted of giving unconditional basic income for 18 months. And he was there on the stage. He spoke his experience, and he also answered questions. One of the questions he faced was this. So his answer for that was, before this experiment began, my village, which had about 700 people, there were 5 drunkards. After the experiment, there are still 5 drunkards, which means what? That this program has not come and created new fresh drunkards, which means every society may have a small percentage of dysfunctional people, which may express itself, the dysfunctionality may express itself in terms of alcoholism, or drug addiction, or a crime, or blah, blah, whatever you may say. Now, the point is that we should not take that very small exception. So in the process of last 10 years of working on this issue and experiencing this question coming in various forms, I have realized that this question is coming from our own middle class perceptions about the poor. I think we have a perception of the poor that if you give money, they will misuse it. I don't see any evidence. No amount of no pilot study has thrown up this evidence. The Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee also says very clearly that no pilot study has thrown out this, that the people will move into undesirable behavior. On the contrary, in the villages we have seen the productivity and the production has increased. So that would be my immediate response to this question about the economic bads of a society. And on top of it, if you have a large section of population experiencing a sense of security, you have definitely a healthier society.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'll try to end it with, or maybe 2 more questions. I try to connect it to something more broad. So I think we've seen the news and commentary, increasing talk about changes to the idea of work, the future of work. For example, recently the New Zealand Prime Minister recently flagged the idea of having a permanent 4-day working week. So Sarath, to what extent do you think that basic income ought to be considered as simply part of a potentially broader package of policy and cultural changes to working life?
Absolutely. I think you talk to any businessman today, you talk to any industrialist, you talk to any visionary, they will very clearly tell you that most of the repetitive jobs and slightly low end, medium end, intelligent jobs are also can be completely taken over by the robots, taken over by artificial intelligence. I think we are heading for a future where much of the production, much of the economic, much of the production activity can be done by artificial intelligence. You don't need the human beings. And any industrialist again will tell you that it is much easier to deal with the machine than with the man. The liability is much, much more, and you always try to minimize the human employment of you employing people, because managing people requires is very, very complex. So, which means what? Which means technologically, humankind has arrived at a stage where it is possible to generate wealth by the machine. It's already doing it. But the point is, why is that long heritage of scientific knowledge be appropriated by the few people? So when wealth can be generated, I think Stephen Hawking, who was one of the leading physicists, had said before he passed away that today it is possible to manufacture much of it without human beings. And I think generate wealth, and we can be prosperous, provided we agree, all of us agree to share this income equally, at least in an equitable way. So a society like that is what we aspire for. That where the wealth is generated by the machine and human beings can spend more time on more creative and care related pursuits rather than become machines cogs in the wheel. So that is a beautiful vision of the future. I think in a context like that, we should distinguish between work and labor. Labor is something you sell in the market for a wage. Work is something that you love to do and you do. I mean, I think I'm mixing up the definitions, but these are the technical definitions. So I would like to spend more time doing care work, maybe cooking for my family or doing something else, do community work. That may give me much more fulfillment. So we move then to the meaning of work, what work means to us, and what is the meaning of my life itself. We move into those philosophical questions that what gratifies me, what gives me a sense of fulfillment. Is it buying more cars and more consumption, having buying a yacht somewhere, or buying this or buying that? We have become a very consumerist society. So life is not about that. Slowly we are recognizing life is not about that, and the earth, the planet, is also not going to survive if we continue on this path of consumption. So it
Mm.
fits in very well in that scheme of things of the future.
And going back to one final viewer question, this is from Carl Wicked, who's asking, with the understanding that emergency basic income is important and the income from it is important, but mostly the amount of money is here for 1 or 2 months. So what's next for emergency basic income? What are the next steps when considering maybe a post-emergency situation?
Well, I
Can
think the
can there
whole
be a
appeal.
permanent emergency income?
Permanent emergency. Okay, there are two. I mean, they are two contradictory terms. Nothing is emergency can't be permanent. Anyway, that's not the point. I think the emergency. One says emergency basic income. One is using the term also in a very loose way in many places. You can just remove emergency and give basic income after that, having seen the efficaciousness out of it, having seen the what it does to the society, what it does to people who are vulnerable. Now, even normal times, if I am vulnerable, I need emergency basic income. I need a basic income on an emergency basis because I'm extremely vulnerable. So let's not get into the polemics, the terms. Let's say that let us hope that during this period we see the significance and the importance of this element, our policy element, ingredient, and try to continue that even after the emergency goes away, because we see the efficaciousness of it. We see why it will make better sense to have a basic income. When you say basic income, it means unconditional. Why it is important to give everybody a basic income? It's like, when you have a short illness, you change your diet and you change your lifestyle for a while, short while during that period, but some things stick. I'm hoping during this period we learn this lesson and it sticks for the future as well. We'll call it a basic income. We don't call it emergency or recovery, or we just say an unconditional basic income for all.
We have a few more viewer questions, so I'd like to raise something I think close to the work of the APO concerning productivity. So this is from Magdalena Mendoza. How important is the idea of productivity in differentiating between labor and work? I think you made the distinction earlier between labor and work. So how does productivity connect to that differentiation? Obviously in relation
I think there's an inherent desire within the industry to increase and improve productivity. Now, I think artificial intelligence comes precisely there. Automation came, and artificial intelligence now comes that to increase and to improve productivity. Now, in that sense, the human intervention in productivity seems to be so much more at the high-end jobs, at the design jobs, which are the jobs that will stay in the future, and not at the low-end jobs, at the muscle-end jobs. So basically, when you want to increase productivity, you're actually not trying to manage at the shop floor level to improve your productivity, but you're actually trying to improve productivity at a different level. That is the future. So when I say labor and work, when I say work is something that you naturally want to do for yourself or for the community, not a paid job. Whereas labor is something that you transact in the market. Okay, so productivity improvement is what has brought us to a point where artificial intelligence is practically going to take over our lives. I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
Uh, I think you've done a good job at answering it. I think some of the viewers have also practical questions about, for example, how different countries may distribute the cash or allocate the cash associated with emergency basic income and maybe basic income in general.
Well, the standard answer I give in India is that if we can send the satellite to, we can send a rocket to the moon, we can send money to the last man. The point is, how do you fix that last mile? And we have the technology today to fix that last mile. Now, you see in Kenya, they have been, the Give Directly is doing a large 12-year experiment of basic income in Kenya. So there they have teamed up with Vodafone, and they have created something called mobile money. So the money goes into the mobile of any recipient, and they go and redeem it in their local store and local shop. So they made it so easy for that last man, where you don't have this kind of a fancy banks and fancy ATMs and fancy ways of digital money. So this is a simple money that you get some code, and then you just redeem it from the local store. So sending the last man is not at all, it's a problem already solved. It has to be implemented, that's all. It's not something that is impossible to deal with if you have the political will.
And I think this will actually be the final viewer question. So from South Korea, Sejun Jang is worried about populism and the situation, of course, in Venezuela. So I think they're connecting the idea of basic income maybe with populist or extreme deficit spending. So the worry is that government budget is not enough, and government might end up being in huge debt. So do you think what is your view on this? Is this a reasonable concern?
I don't think governments are worried about deficits. I think when we can have deficit for X purpose, you can have deficit for this purpose. But I think the to what extent that particular economy can withstand and have it. I see. Let me say one thing that, like all concepts, even the basic income concept also can be misused. So when I say those 5 characteristics, unless you have those 5 characteristics, you should also, technically speaking, not call a basic income. It may not be basic income, but it's a fancy word today. Everybody would like to use that. So I think it's for I would not like to comment on any particular country the way they are dealing with deficit, but I think it's a judicious decision they have to take, and the civil society should participate in that. And the deficit caused for because we give a basic income is far minimal compared to the deficits caused by the military spending in many countries. So I think it's a question of priorities of that particular country. I think you can write to me. We can have this conversation on that issue. I think given this short time, we cannot go into that. But thank you for raising a very important question. I think populism we are all popular democracies, so populism is bound to come and abuse some of very good concepts.
And I think just the final question, for people who are interested in learning more about basic income, what sort of resources or people or organizations would you point them to?
Well, I think Basic Income Earth Network is a network, global network. I'm the vice president of it, and we have affiliates in 45 countries. And Basic Income Earth Network has a website. I think you can go to the website. I think you can enormous amount of resources you have. In fact, they have a new website we also created called Emergency Basic Income. Just type emergencybasicincome.com. You will have also a lot of resources about what is happening during the COVID times. So, or you just write to me, whatever I can point out to what resources you want, what kind of work. There is a popular stuff, there is a popular writings, there is the academic writings, and there is all kinds of writings in the last 10 years. Huge amount of literature is there on basic income. I think all kinds of disciplines are coming and trying to examine the efficaciousness, the nature of this policy pathway. We have tremendous amount of resources. Please reach out to anybody in the Basic Income Earth Network and just write to us. We'll do our best to. Yeah.
So now 1 hour has passed. I'd like to thank all the viewers for their engagement. Of course, if you have any more questions or comments, please leave them under the video on YouTube. And I think we can forward them to Sarath. And I think he would appreciate engaging more in depth with people interested in his ideas, the ideas of around basic
Absolutely.
income.
Please feel free to write to us.
And also, if you have any other suggestions on topics that the APO can tackle and invite speakers to talk about, please let us know in the comments as well. I'd like to, of course, thank Sarath for sharing his valuable time and knowledge with us. I think there have been a lot of interesting things discussed. And of course, with all this thinking about policies and the related larger issues that the idea of basic income is related to, we at the APO hope to work with our member governments in considering all potential means of supporting continued development, well-being, and productivity. So thank you very much for your time today, viewers. We look forward to seeing you at our next productivity talk. And to do this in an easy way, please like or subscribe to our YouTube channel or on our other social media channels. So that's Twitter, Facebook page, LinkedIn, etc. I hope everyone stays safe, happy, and productive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, APO. This is it's a very well structured 1 hour we have spent. And anybody, please reach out. Thank you so much. And stay safe and be productive. Bye-bye. Thank you.